So I was puzzled as a young doctor, how do we help patients prepare for death? And I was sort of reading everything I could, trying to think through this. There has to be a model, there has to be a way. I read all the books that all the doctors wrote on this, couldn't find anything that was really helpful. And then I had this really brief, there was this very brief comment about the ars moriendi, Latin for art of dying. Again, this genre of literature. And this genre developed, it didn't just sort of develop on its own. The instigation was the bubonic plague outbreak of the mid-1300s, which, as you said, historians estimate that perhaps as many as 2/3 of the population was wiped out. Now, I think there's some variance, but even in earlier and later iterations of the plague, in some urban areas, the town records report 50-60% of the population wiped out. So the fact that in some jurisdictions, at least between 1/3 and 2/3 died is incredible. Now, if you think about COVID for a second, and it was, less than 0.3% of the population, right? Which is not to minimize. I was a frontline COVID doctor in New York. It was horrible. And we had, trucks, semi-trucks parked all over New York City that just had bodies in them, refrigerated trucks full of bodies, of corpses. So it was horrible, but this is a tiny percentage of the population. What if it was 1 out of 3 or 2 out of 3? I mean, where do the bodies go, right? And so as society sort of emerged, Western Europe emerged from this outbreak of plague, it had to rebuild itself. I mean, what was left? What was left of the social structures? The social structure in late Middle Ages in Western Europe was really the church. And this is before you get the Protestant Reformation. So it's really the Western church that was the social authority. Were there minority religions? Absolutely. There were other groups. There were non-religious people, sure. But this was the dominant authority. And so the people who survived, many of them were concerned that their loved ones who died were burning somewhere in hell, right? Because they weren't buried properly. They didn't get the last rites or the anointing of the sick. They didn't get the rituals and the proper burials, the religious attendance that they were supposed to get. And so who knows now? Where are all these people? So the survivors of the plague then turned to their social authorities, the priests who survived, and said, all right, we need some help in preparing for death. Because death is going to come back. If it's not plague, it's going to be war, it's going to be famine. Death is a fact of life. And that's the way people lived really until about 100 years ago, really until antibiotics, right, which was the late 20s. And really it was the 40s when antibiotics became a thing. So it's only been in the last 100 years that death kind of became optional. And then we had the concomitant rise of the hospital, and so people are no longer seeing the dead. How many of you have cared for someone as they're dying? Okay, 6, 7, 8? It would have been everybody 100 years ago. Everybody would have been with someone to the end. So we think about this kind of, is it a modern project then to keep death in the background, right? So anyway, there's this kind of cry on the part of the survivors, we need some help. One of the reasons I was attracted to the ars moriendi is because I will tell you, I think my fellow physicians are pretty terrible at telling patients when they're dying. Some of them are quite good at it. They tend to go into palliative care. But the fact that doctors have now outsourced difficult conversations to a subspecialist in medicine is pretty pathetic, but that's the state of medicine today. Somebody's dying? Call the doctors who deal with death. We don't, and it used to be that every doctor had these conversations 100 years ago, until 100 years. So I was interested in the ars moriendi as a model because it was empowering of individuals and their communities, because living as with dying is always a community activity, right? We're relational creatures. We need to walk the dog and run into the neighbors. We need to have meals together. And that's part of being human, is to be in relationship. But part of living then, and also part of dying, is to die in relationship. And so I love this idea of empowering individuals in the context of their communities to think about what it means to die well, and then by extension, what it means to live well, because the two are very much intertwined.